Alrighty, everybody. Once again, good morning. Thanks for joining us at this 2021 State of IAM webinar. We're gonna start off today by introducing who's talking with you guys. My name is Zach DeMeyer. I'm on the product marketing team at JumpCloud, and with me today is Doug Cahill. He's the VP and Group Director at ESG. Doug, would you like to say a few things about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Zach, and thanks everybody for joining today's webinar. Zach mentioned, my name is Doug Cahill. I'm the practice lead for cybersecurity ESG and also senior analyst covering cloud security and identity access management. I've been with the company for about 5 years. We conduct a lot of research, and so I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some recently conducted research on this very topic on how cloud is driving identity access management initiatives.
Thanks, Doug. And with us, we also have Rajat Bhargava, the CEO and co-founder of JumpCloud. Raj, can you share a few words with us as well, please?
Sure. Thanks for joining the webinar today. Appreciate it. I'm co-founder and CEO of JumpCloud. We are a cloud directory services platform, and we're excited to talk a little bit about some of the research that we sponsored for Doug to go out there and do in the market, and talk a little bit about how those trends are going to impact you in the field.
Awesome. So to start out, let me give you guys a little bit of background. So the goal for this webinar is to identify some of the challenges and subsequently the security threats that organizations today are facing due to their shift to the cloud, due to remote work, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as just other challenges that IT admins face. To figure out sort of just kind of the levels of these things, we surveyed senior IT administrators, directors, decision makers from across the US and Canada, with a range of both mid-market and enterprise organizations represented. And yeah, we found some interesting things. Doug, would you like to kind of talk through what ESG was thinking throughout this whole process?
Yeah, Zach, absolutely. You know, I think taking the temperature is the right way to put it. In another study at the end of last year, we asked a pretty simple question of respondents in that particular study, which was, hey, to what degree has your organization's use of cloud services impacted your identity and access management program? And nearly half, 49%, it's had a significant impact on their program. And moving forward, they cited priorities like, hey, you know, we need to broaden our use of MFA, really broaden our use of SSO. And that was before the pandemic. That was before the surge in remote work. But, you know, nonetheless, that initial set of data sort of whetted our appetite. We wanted to learn more, right? We wanted to sort of really dive into how broad adoption of cloud impacts identity access management strategies, what the problem space is in terms of operational challenges and threat landscape, what controls are being employed, what are viewed as most important, and where there's incremental spend being allocated for additional controls. And really look at sort of the organizational model. You know, how are companies getting themselves aligned and organized internally around securing, obviously now is an increase in remote work and an increased dependence around cloud applications and services. Before we dive into the research, and Raj and I are going to sort of compare notes as we go along here on what we think the research means really to all of you on today's webinar in terms of how it's actionable. Before we get to that, we just wanted to share with you sort of ESG's point of view around a theme, and this came out really clearly in the research, the need for a unified approach. You know, the first thing is just to note, I guess, sort of a bit obvious, is that, you know, very often the adoption of cloud services is decentralized. You know, it's happening out of the line of business, and there's a need for business agility, and they're either subscribing to SaaS applications or standing up their own app dev team to be able to develop new applications to bring those to market. And what that creates is silos. It creates, you know, the sort of modality of, you know, separate teams using separate controls to secure separate environments. And I appreciate like the need for agility to move quickly to meet a market opportunity, but that results in, you know, lack of consistent policies and really leaving applications and data exposed. The other dynamic is, I guess what I would sort of characterize as like the access matrix. You know, think about like the combination of access scenarios that IT and cyber teams are now charged with securing. It's really like any user, any device, any location, anytime, any application. Like that's the matrix, the sort of set of combinations that we now need to secure. Obviously, remote work has expanded what many of us refer to as the identity perimeter. And again, that's really characterized as, this sort of remit, this charge of IT and cyber teams to secure a really complicated set of scenarios. Okay, that was sort of the problem space. I'm going to go from sort of, glass half empty to glass half full, hopefully. And the first one is to really chat a little about zero trust. And later in the webinar, Raj and I are going to sort of compare notes on how we think about zero trust and how that can be an actionable strategy for organizations. And it is just that from ESG's point of view is that, we shouldn't be thinking about zero trust as a product. It's really an approach. It's one that says, hey, we got to move from sort of this trust but verify, default model in cybersecurity, that one really that thinks about like everything could be a threat. Every individual, every entity poses a risk to the organization. And so we've got to shift to from default allow to default deny, one that says, hey, if I assume you are potentially malicious or your credentials have been stolen, then I'm going to deny by default. I'm going to verify, and then I'm going to continuously verify by issuing additional factors, thinking about how your device is part of your identity, that sort of thing. So again, zero trust more of a strategy than really a product. And then, finally, as I sort of let off on this slide, we really need to get to a unified approach. So we got to balance like, yep, the line of business needs to go fast. They need to have the autonomy to be agile, to be able to stand up their own applications. At the same time, we do need to centralize. We need to converge our organizational model. So we have a single team that's thinking about our identity access management policies. We've got to converge around a consolidated stack of technologies that provides an integrated experience, and that's going to provide a better security posture. By having consistency of access policies, we're gonna raise our game and really be in a much better place. And I think what's encouraging, from the research, our respondents are going here. So, yep, we started out siloed. We're definitely moving to a unified approach, and that's really encouraging for me.
Doug, I'll jump in with a couple of things here. I think, stepping back, one of the interesting parts of surveys and doing some benchmarking is that everybody gets a chance and an opportunity to kind of see where they are in the life cycle. So we're able to see where the trends are, where people are going, and then everybody can benchmark where they are against that. And of course, there's many, many reasons about why people are where they are, but at least you have a sense for where the trajectory is, and you can factor that into your organization. Where do you put your time, your money, your resources, your energy, if you will, in terms of where you want to head. The second point I would make is that the comments here about the point of view really have been very interesting to JumpCloud from the standpoint of we have this concept of the domainless enterprise, and something that we've been talking about for quite a long time, which is this concept of basically moving away from a perimeter, if you will, a domain-based environment, the chance to use any type of device, any user, any location, any application, any system. Those kinds of things we think continue to be more and more important out in the market. And I think the research that you did just reemphasized how critical and important it is for IT organizations to be able to control and manage everything out there.
Yeah, really, how do we go from this sort of traditional castle and moat model? And again, you're hearing this a lot over the course of the webinar, but the sort of amorphous perimeter accelerated by remote work. But Raj, I guess I love your first point about benchmarking. I mean, we need more community in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity should not be a point of competitive differentiation between organizations. Like, this should absolutely be a team sport. And that's right. What we look to share in the the results from this kind of research, it is a benchmark. Here's how your peer group is thinking about the problem space, and more importantly, here's how they're solving. Yeah,
that's right. Agreed.
Well said, gentlemen. Well, with that, let's dive into the data itself. So first off, let's talk about the cloud. Clearly, the shift to remote work has moved a lot of people to the cloud, but then even before that, cloud adoption has been on the rise. Do you guys have anything you want to say before we hop into the data here, or should we just get right into it?
Zach,
go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Zach, as you're clicking to the next slide, what we didn't think we needed to do in this research was to quantify number of SaaS applications or app dev projects or IaaS and PaaS services. Like, we know we're well past the tipping point on the broad adoption of cloud. We know the remote work has further accelerated the use of specific types of cloud applications collaboration is one of them, right? I mean, all of us are living on so many video conferencing calls today. We wanted to more get into the nature of cloud usage, sort of the complexion, like how strategic is it? And the first thing we asked was basically, hey, where do your business critical applications live today? Where are they going to live moving forward? And on the one hand, while the theme of today's study is cloud-driven identities and how the broad adoption of cloud has impacted identity and access management programs, I'm mindful of the fact that, you know, old technology has a long tail, and that most organizations operate in a hybrid multi-cloud context, and they're going to for a while, which is to say that, yes, there's absolutely an increase of business critical SaaS applications. There's an increase of business critical internally developed cloud native applications running an IaaS and PaaS platform, but there are and there will continue to be business critical applications that are running on-prem, and users need access to all of those.
Doug, I use these last 2 points as sort of basically a proxy for heterogeneity. So cloud adoption is now multi-cloud, multi-vendor, but I think a lot of other things are going to that multi-vendor, multi-resource type of opportunity. You can talk about devices, talk about applications, you can talk about infrastructure. And so I think the key point here is people are looking for a lot of choice. They're looking for what's right for their organization. They want to know that when they choose things that it matches up with their business needs. And I think with so many great IT tools out there, IT systems, it's now easier than ever to find things that fit what you're trying to do. And there's a lot of comfort now that you can use non sort of Microsoft or non, let's say AWS solutions and still make it work. It doesn't have to be from one particular vendor.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, optionality definitely yields heterogeneity, and there's also just the self-service dynamic of cloud. You know, we're gone to the days where a business unit had a requirement, they went to this centralized IT team, and maybe in 6 to 9 months they had their new business application. So now it's like,
that's right.
Man, I can self-serve. I can just go and get that application and solve my need.
And it used to be heterogeneity equaled increased overhead and increased management costs. I don't think that that's true anymore. It could be true partially, but I think it's moving much more to the independence of choose whatever you want. There are going to be management tools that cut across all those different types of solutions, and you're going to have still the control that you need and without the extra overhead.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you might start using, you know, controls that are native to that particular environment, but there are now solutions that are more, dare I say, platform-like, right? That sort of unify that experience across all your heterogeneous things.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, if the world is moving towards having more types of systems so that people do have choice and they can fit things in better to their organization, then clearly the management tools will follow suit and they will be able to manage those multi-vendor solutions much easier.
You bet. Hey, speaking of multiple vendors, our next slide is on that very topic, which is really around multi-cloud usage. And so again, it's like we know that organizations are consuming services from multiple CSPs. In this particular example, we looked at infrastructure and platform as a service. And we didn't, you know, we're sort of less interested in, hey, are you consuming services from multiple CSPs? Because we know that's happening. We want to know more about, like, is that strategic? Like, are you doing that in a meaningful way? Or are you toe dipping? And it's right down the middle. You know, half the respondents says, yeah, you know what, I am subscribing to services from multiple CSPs, but I really have one primary CSPs and the other one or two are tactical for me. But half of the respondents said, no, you know what, I have a meaningful consumption of IaaS and PaaS services. And actually, just to Raj's point, we did a data cut around, okay, so for those organizations that are using multiple CSPs in a meaningful way, what does that mean to their tooling? And it's more likely that you're going to be using a third-party control that can give you a unified security posture across multiple CSPs if your use of multiple CSPs is strategic versus tactical.
I mean, what this slide told me, Doug, is that basically every organization now has a license to go do what's best for them. So there's no one sort of size fits all, if you will. It is now choose whatever is right for you, and you have the agency to go do that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you know, the one hand, that's goodness. On the other hand, I just think about the IT and the cyber team, like, how do I secure that reality? And so then it goes back to my view, you got to have a unified approach.
Yep.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that dovetails really well into our next section, talking about the challenges that IT teams are facing. Obviously, like you said, this freedom of choice also comes with the other side of that sword, which is people need to manage the identities that they're using into all these platforms that they're accessing. So let's see what we found regarding those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question here was really around how a company's use of cloud services has impacted identity access management with respect to top challenge. And if you look at the responses that are highlighted in sort of, I guess it's a light blue, those are all indicative of this issue of lack of consistency, which is the #1 challenge, which to Roger's point says, yep, my business units are enjoying freedom of choice and get how that drives business. But as the team charged with securing freedom of choice, I have issues like I lack the ability to have centralized visibility control over which users are accessing our most sensitive data. I don't have a single identity for users who access cloud and on-prem resources. Our directory service doesn't span all of our assets, be they on-prem or cloud. And that, again, is really that top line that you see in the orange box, which is maintaining consistency is really problematic. And secondly, that's been exacerbated by remote work, which all of us working from remote now need access to a diverse range of applications. So yes, direct to cloud, no perimeter, but there are many legacy applications that are still sitting behind the firewall, and you get a VPN in. So that's back to that sort of matrix of combinations in which users need to access resources.
So I took this one sort of to a higher level, Doug, and I was really thinking about it from the standpoint of, if you thought back to Microsoft's vision many, many years ago, it was to have a computer on every desk. And then mobile showed up and we said, well, great, the vision now is we want to have a mobile phone in everybody's hands. Well, I think one of the really big picture visions now is to give anybody the safe, frictionless access to whatever it is they need, whatever IT resource they need. I think that's sort of a next wave of challenge that we're facing, is how do we give everybody access to what they need in a safe way? It's easy and it's secured. So I think, to me, that's sort of like the next generation of what we're going to be focused on for many, many years.
Yeah, the end user experience that you're weaving in here, Raj, is such a huge deal. Like later, we're going to talk about MFA or the lack of use of MFA.
Yep.
And we'll get into this, like I said, but a lot of that is just sort of balancing securing access with also having a frictionless end user experience, because that's the design center. That is the requirement.
Yeah, how can it be invisible to the end user effectively, but the security is still at the level that we all want it to be at? That's a really, really difficult problem to solve.
Yeah. How do you implement zero trust without impeding workflows?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a lot of what Raj just mentioned sort of really is highlighted on this slide. And this is sort of a range of problem statements, and we are going to move from problem space to solution space in just a little bit, but this really speaks to the cost and complexity that heterogeneity introduces, both with respect to the diversity of an organization's cloud footprint, but also the diversity of the devices that are being used to access cloud applications and on-prem resources. And obviously, we know complexity is an enemy of cybersecurity, but it is the reality of the landscape. And there's a perception right now that, that's the second point down, that environmental differences necessitate using separate controls, and separate controls increases cost and complexity. And so we really need to shift from that. Again, this is sort of that siloed mentality to one that is a more unified approach. Now, the third one down around users are now using different device types than they did before also came through in an ESG study around remote work. So we know that when we all sort of flipped the switch, we had to start working from our home offices. Not everybody had a company issued PC, and not everybody had a even a bring your own device that had been vetted as trustworthy. And so there's an increase on sort of new devices that are being used to access cloud applications, and that clearly from our respondents is creating a challenge. Last thing I'll mention in this slide, then hand out to Raj, is this notion of mapping. It's really correlating, hey, which users and service accounts have access to our most sensitive data? And as we go to a perimeterless world, this is notion of sort of a visibility gap where I can't go physically touch infrastructure, it's abstracted in the cloud. And so there's a greater need to really correlate user identities, non-human identities with your most critical cloud resident assets via the applications or data.
I think, Doug, for me, this slide screamed standards. So it was one of those things where it was, the big vendors out there, they aren't necessarily making it easy for their platforms to interoperate with their competitors, if you will. So AWS does not make it super easy for you to integrate with AWS or Azure, for instance, and vice versa. And the problem is that that's not in their best interest necessarily, but it is in our best interest, sort of as consumers of it, to try and cut away those sort of differences. And the way generally that's done is through standards and protocols and things like that. So ultimately, that's why a whole cadre of tools and vendors have emerged to basically normalize those different platforms so that you can easily conduct your business across whatever you need to. But ultimately, that's going to be done through standards and protocols. So if the big vendors can support those standards and protocols, makes it much easier for all of us as consumers to have success with their platforms.
Yeah, well, it's a great point. I mean, it goes back to we shouldn't be competing on cyber, and so we should have that level of abstraction. We do lack standards in the whole cybersecurity market. We have some like Ceph and Leaf propagate alerts up into SAML, obviously, in an access management context. But it really sort of reminds me, back in the network management days, you had standard ways to instrument heterogeneous networking devices. There should be a standard, at least a baseline on how you instrument heterogeneous cloud services. Yeah, absolutely agree.
Great points. So that brings us on into threats to kind of talk back to something you were talking about earlier, Doug. Clearly, there's a challenge with mapping user access to all these cloud resources that people are adopting, and as a response, things are falling through the cracks. And looking through these next coming slides, there's some very damning facts that come out. So let's dive into those and kind of see what sort of threats people are facing today.
Yeah, you bet. So in addition to asking what kind of attacks organizations have experienced against their company's cloud footprint, we also asked what kind of attacks they're worried about. And we didn't share that slide with you today because, no surprise, there are a lot of things to be worried about. And they were all of sort of relative equal weighting. We thought it more interesting and more actionable for everybody on today's webinar to really understand, where and how are a company's cloud portfolio getting compromised. Now, unfortunately, only roughly a quarter of the respondents, 24%, said that their company hadn't experienced an attack on their cloud footprint, so 3/4 had. And if we look at the most common types of attacks, there's very much a standard theme here, which is 4 out of the 6 of the top attack types that companies have experienced are all identity related. It's about identities being compromised. Now, it could be, as an example of the top one, cloud service application configured with overly permissive privileges. That's very often a byproduct of this issue of silos, which is, I'm a line of business, I'm going fast, I'm self-serving a cloud application. Really, I'm doing my own identity access management, right? And I'm setting up overprivileged accounts because I don't have a centralized directory store. I'm not working with a centralized team that has a policy that then gets instantiated across all the user accounts that are configured to be able to access cloud applications. So a lot of the issues you see here in terms of misuse of a privileged account or compromised user credentials are a byproduct of other dynamics of silos of identities. The other one I would mention is adversaries are running the same plays, but maybe against new users. So spear phishing and privileged credentials. Unfortunately, what we're seeing all too common is adversaries conducting recon on social media, finding out, for example, who's the Salesforce.com admin at this company, who's a DevOps engineer at another company, and then spear phishing those organizations to be able to conduct an account takeover attack, to be able to steal the creds that are privileged. And now, in the case of a DevOps engineer, you get access to the Cloud Console. In the case of a Salesforce admin, you've got access to an organization's CRM data. This obviously begs the MFA question we're going to get into, but these are, these are some of the most common attack types that organizations are sharing. And again, it's a common thread here around identities.
I think
Raj,
one of the interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Doug. Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, when you connect with your customers, what's top of mind for them in terms of the threat landscape, and what are they experiencing?
I mean, obviously, we end up, it's sort of self-fulfilling because we're in the identity space. So people are coming to us really looking at, how do they step up their security and identities. So whether that's multi-factor authentication, whether that's controlling access to the right privileges, whether that's ensuring that identities are secure through salted and hashed passwords and through tokens via SAML and SCIM and things like that. There's a variety of different things that they come to us for. But I think one of the interesting things that has happened is that I think a lot of organizations are now indexing their security spend much more towards identity protection than things that we used to do, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where networks, and protecting the sort of perimeter was the most important thing. Firewalls and IDSs, IPSs, all these things used to be the number one thing that people would invest in. But I think that's changing pretty quickly, where people are realizing that, at the end of the day, if you get the right identity, it doesn't matter what security solutions you have in place, because those are meant to bypass all of those different solutions. So to us, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a realization that identity attacks are the number one way that people get compromised. It is the number one way that people need to protect themselves. And not all of it is just technology. A lot of it is also training their staff and training their team to understand how do they protect themselves, because IT admins know and IT teams know that they can't do it alone, especially when it comes to identities.
Yeah, awareness training just needs to be on a rinse and repeat cycle. For example, one of the things that the annual Verizon database incident report highlights is it's very often the same users that are getting duped into a phishing attack. So we're really going to focus on, being more vigilant. Also developers, so we often think about sort of the end user getting phished, but it's also developers that are running cloud native applications and creating service accounts in which to make API calls, and we've got to make sure we're scoping privileges on those calls. And that takes, developers they're trying to move fast too. They're under increasing pressure to write more code, push to prod more quickly, and aren't necessarily thinking about, using a wildcard for privileges and for a service account when maybe they only need, write access, but they're also granting read access. So education, big one, end users and developers.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
So we're making a connection here between the need for a strong identity and access management program and data loss. And, unfortunately, there were two things that came to light here with respect to data loss. One was an appreciable amount of organizations shared what they've had data loss. But almost more concerning for me is the roughly quarter of respondents who said they weren't really sure. And the old adage in cyber, you can't secure what you can't see, is certainly true here. And I think one of the byproducts is just this, again, silos of identities and not properly scoping privileges and using things like MFA. And so that's leaving a lot of organizations just absolutely unsure whether or not their cloud resident data has in fact been compromised. Now, we also asked, hey, how much of your data is cloud resident? How much of that is sensitive? And suffice to say, more and more data is migrating northbound, if you will, to the cloud, and a lot of that data is sensitive by virtue of the fact that a lot of cloud apps are business critical. The data that's associated with those apps are sensitive. Raj, what'd you think here about this sort of almost lack of sort of conviction from respondents as to whether or not their company had experienced data loss?
I mean, the lack of conviction says to me they probably have, and they just don't know it. So, and I think, going back to the last slide where, 25% basically said, hey, we haven't experienced any breaches or threats or anything like that. I mean, I think it's hard to believe those things. I mean, there's so much activity these days going on, and it is easy. I think some of it's definitional too. So, we can define it as, somebody externally hasn't stolen our data. Well, what about internally too? So you have people coming and going, if you will. You have contractors. You have a lot of chances of things being compromised. And the other piece of it is a lot of people don't realize that people download data onto their machines. Those machines then get compromised. So the cloud service that you use may have been totally secure and fine, and you never experienced an issue there. But a machine where a bunch of data resided because people downloaded it and operated on it and did whatever they needed to do is still there, and then that got compromised. So I think this is a question. It's sort of like you pulled on a little bit of the thread, and we answered the question at the top of the thread, if you will. But if you pulled on it a little bit further, it goes on and on and on. And now all of a sudden it probably explodes to where my guess is that this number is very, very high, that a lot of people have experienced data loss, and they just don't put it together. They don't realize that it's put together with a compromised device or something of that nature.
Yeah, well, there's data loss, and there's just, to your point, sort of compromised data. And it's sort of this notion of data channels. I mean, data is flowing to and from cloud apps. Cloud apps enable a tremendous amount of collaboration. It goes back to sort of balancing that, business requirement that cloud enables with securing that use. And your point, absolute increase in third-party access to corporate data, so increase, third-party risk.
Yeah, and I think part of it is on that slide, we basically said data loss. Well, data loss can mean a lot of different things. Data loss doesn't have to equal data compromised, but it's still gone. And I'm sure that many cloud services, people have lost data for whatever reason. Even some of it is user error. I know that, if you delete a file on Google Workspaces or Microsoft 365 or Microsoft 365 now, I guess, some of that data is gone and is not backed up. And now there's services that do those backups, but that happens. You hear about that all the time where people have deleted their data accidentally, and it's catastrophic, and they have to go back and recreate it. But that's sort of different and distinct from compromised data.
Yes. Yeah. So naturally, we wanted to dig into common causes of data loss, and we found, again, back to the identities theme, that there was a common thread around data loss, which is users. To the point Raj just made, is that very often data loss is due to a careless action of an insider, not malicious. One of the things that comes to mind for me here, Raj, is over the last half dozen years or so, there's been a lot of focus on shadow IT and sort of the use of unsanctioned cloud applications that can lead to things like data loss. We actually find that the improper use of sanctioned applications is more of a greater cause of data being compromised or lost, because employees aren't following policy. And then to your point, the third one down is data exposed from remote users and personal devices. Some of us just like to have local copies, and maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we're not. That's against policy, and maybe that device gets compromised, and we're not running current endpoint security software. We get spearfish, malware, takes a foothold on our endpoint and gets access to our data. And actually, that particular issue seems to be more common and more prominent in mid-market companies. So we found that those organizations that are characterized by mid-market reported that it was more likely that their cause of data loss was directly associated with remote users and the use of personal devices.
And obviously now with the work from home, that's that's going to be accentuated now dramatically. The other one, I'd give some very simple examples that, bring this point home to me. You're on Google Workspaces and you are sharing a document. The default settings often on Google are to be pretty permissive on sharing, and all of a sudden you've got people viewing a sensitive document or a confidential document that they weren't supposed to, or even outside of the organization, if for some reason it got shared. And so there's so many issues like that, but it's also analogous to you type in an email and you accidentally send it to the wrong person. It's sort of no different, but those happen, accidents happen all day, every day. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of data that gets shared. Now, there are solutions that focus on those things, and that's good. I mean, even, especially in the case of Google Workspaces, they do try and say, did you really mean to send it to this person? Did you really mean to share it with this person? Which is a great step, but accidents still happen. And, those are the easy ones. Forget about the data got compromised or got hacked. It's, those are the ones that happen every day, all day long.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been that guy, right? Damn autofill.
Yes, yeah. It's happened.
Hey, let's change the tone and go to solutions. So let's go from sort of problem space to how we're going to move the needle.
It sounds like a great point. So right here we have a big word, unification, which is something that we've sort of alluded to the entire time, this congealing together of the identity from all these disparate siloed points into one centralized core. And yeah, it's interesting because, you think back to the earliest days of IT, right? And you've got the Microsoft model of, Active Directory sitting on top and its identity federating out to everything. With the introduction of, different vendors supplying different solutions in the cloud, we've really kind of broken that up, like you've said. So it'll be interesting here to kind of see, is there a way that, IT teams can take back the identity, if you will? Let's see what we found.
Yeah, so I love this finding because it's up-leveling the conversation to think strategically. And it really says that, hey, we need an organizational-wide approach for identity access management across our heterogeneous footprint of applications and devices and work locations. And to do that, a lot of organizations are now migrating to a cloud-based platform because that provides them centralized policy with distributed enforcement. I think this is going to be a really common model in cybersecurity now, be it for network security, cloud security, endpoint security. In this context, identity access management, it just makes sense that I've got a control plane that's in the cloud, so I can centralize that, and that gives me, visibility across all my properties. And then enforcement will be distributed across all the control points that comprises a hybrid multi-cloud environment. So Raj, I love this finding. I thought it was really encouraging that, our respondents are really thinking strategically on how they balance this sort of, enabling freedom of choice, but securing it at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, no question. So I think the IT community is obviously very smart. They see the transitions, they know what's going on. They know that there's so much opportunity to step up and level up their organizations. And what does that translate to? It translates into higher performing organizations, higher performing employees, safer environments. And now, obviously, in the environment that we're in, it enables everybody to work remotely and do that safely and securely. So I think the promise of this is great. I think obviously the challenge, as everybody knows, is getting from here to there is always the difficult part. But I think people's perspective and vision of where they want to head is absolutely in the right spot. It's a question of what's the easiest and fastest and most cost-effective way to get there.
Yeah, that's a great lead into the next slide. I mean, it's high level. Just think about the identity access management program comprised of people, process, and technology. Keep it real simple. We're going to start, with people. And I do a lot of research and sort of writing and speaking around this notion of secure DevOps or DevSecOps, and sort of a term you either love or hate, but neither here nor there. But the point of that whole initiative is really it's about culture. It's about treating cybersecurity as a priority, internalizing it as a shared responsibility across all team members. And so when I think about the distributed nature of cloud consumption, I think lines of business really need to also start taking responsibility for cyber, including identity access management. So one of the things we wanted to understand in this particular study is, are we converging, right? Are we going from the siloed approach to really getting on the same page, where we have a single team that absolutely is working collaboratively for the line of business. They may have a cloud center of excellence. It's a cross-functional team that serves as sort of an organizational construct to gain organizational alignment on the importance of cyber and consistency of identity access management policies. And what you're seeing on the screen here is that we've got, rough and tough, a quarter of the respondents are already there, be it either unifying and converging their identity access management teams for all their cloud properties and or cloud and on-prem, so 22 and 27% respectively. A lot of this is work in progress. So directionally, there's another roughly 40% that, yep, hey, we got different teams today, but to Raj's point, IT teams are super smart. They know where the hockey puck is going, if you will. I'm in Boston, I'm a hockey fan. So we got to converge teams. So quarter already there, another 40-ish% are sort of on their way. And where we're going to land, roughly is 2/3 of the organizations are going to have a converged model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, it's like a lot of things in the IT world where they start out as sort of one-offs, if you will, in different silos or departments, and people are trying different things. AWS started that way a long time ago, where a few people are playing with it, and now, of course, it's a central part of the strategy for an organization. It's a normal gradient, if you will, of how things evolve over time.
It's so true. I mean, we see this, we're speaking specifically about identity access management impacted by cloud. I see this in other cloud security domains. Cloud workload security, for example, I may be using a different control for my, AWS resident EC2 instances that I do for my on-prem ESX servers. That's sort of initial starting state, but over time, organizations converge to have a unified approach. So,
yep, totally makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so for those converged organizations to be successful, they need to move away from using a series of point tools. We don't get said complexities in the cybersecurity, and you typically do start with silos or separate teams, separate controls. It's just not tenable over time. And so really consistent with the trend of converging organizational structures, we're also seeing a trend toward consolidating vendors. Our respondents were very clear that we want to procure more controls from less vendors. There are a variety of reasons for that. Some are economic, pricing leverage. It's really operational efficiency and consistency of policy, where if you can get a centralized, in this case, an access management platform, you get consistency across all your properties.
And obviously, that's exactly what we see in our business, Doug. So we're in the cloud directory services platform world, and to us, that sort of directory platform is a pretty broad thing. It means core directory services. It means single sign-on. It means multi-factor authentication. It means things like privileged access management and governance. So that's absolutely an MDM and device security as well. So all those things are part of what we see in what customers talk to us every single day, where they say, integrate these things together into one platform so that it's much, much easier for us to manage it. It's also much, much more cost effective for us to execute on this as well. So 100% what we see in our business today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting here is, sometimes efficacy and efficiency are competing objectives, and they really don't need to be. You gain so much operational efficiency by getting out of the business of racking, stacking on-prem management servers to consuming security as a cloud delivered service. And by doing that, you also gain much greater efficacy because you have consistency of policy across your disparate environments. So those don't need to be at odds. We can solve for both efficacy and efficiency at the same time.
I think this is also happening across all of IT, right? So you can look at Office versus Google Workspaces, if you will. So Google Workspaces is integrating a lot of different things. They're doing it, say, maybe You could argue they don't have the same functionality that Microsoft 365 has, but in a lot of ways, it's probably good enough for many organizations and it's significant enough. But they were one of the early folks to integrate video conferencing, for example, and Google Hangouts became pretty easy for people to use. Now it's called Meets, but as an alternative to Zoom or Teams, that example is there. And the same thing is happening in the IAM world as well.
It's that integrated experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right on. So we've talked a lot throughout about this concept of zero trust and the ability to essentially control everyone's ability to access everything by going down to the very barest and saying deny everything and then build trust over time. Let's see what the industry thinks about that concept as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ways we should be thinking about zero trust is also a means to implement least privilege. To sort of reduce your blast radius, you want to have the least amount of users and service accounts having access to the least amount of resources with the least amount of privileges. So we're really scoping to least privilege by first verifying, trust. And the refining is that, trust is multidimensional. And so what we found from our respondents here is we asked, hey, when you think about securing access to your organization's cloud applications and service, what are your most important controls? Raj, I get mixed feelings here. I know MFA is at the top of the list, but this is where, we sort of go on a rant on like, why aren't we using MFA more? So we're going to talk in the next slide about how organizations are using MFA. And there are a lot of really important controls on this list, and you can see from the way we structured organizations, respondents could choose 3. So I'm sort of a mixed mind here. I am encouraged that MFA is at the top, but I'm still a little befuddled that MFA isn't more broadly adopted.
Yeah, I mean, so we see this in our business all the time. It's something that we track. We want our customers using multi-factor authentication on everything. We try and make it as easy as possible. But the truth is, multi-factor authentication is generally, not always, it's generally another step. And that's a step that is just one more thing that an end user needs to do. So it ends up being a friction point for a lot of organizations. We would argue, take that friction point. It's okay, it's not the end of the world, it's pretty fast. We and a lot of others have tried to make it super seamless and easy, but it's still challenging. So we encourage people 2 things that we've always said. One is use MFA wherever possible. So whether that's SMS code, push application, TOTP device, WebAuthn device, whatever it is, like anything's better than nothing, frankly, right? And obviously not all of those are equal. Some are better than others and some are easier than others. But in the end, just do something. Just do another factor. And especially on your email accounts, because those things are so important these days. They are sort of the control point for a wide variety of other accounts. So put MFA on there first and foremost. The second thing is something that we have encouraged a lot of people to do, which is a little bit of back to the future, which is don't change passwords on websites. So this is where phishing comes in a great deal, where, and it doesn't work for everything, but one of the things that we've done with our platform is, especially for changing passwords on your on key accounts like Office 365 or Google or whatever it may be, we do that on a machine. So that to us is really important. There are systems out there that will let you change a password on a machine, which is far safer than changing it on a website. And those changes can propagate out to a wide range of the applications and systems that you use. Now, everybody can't do it. It doesn't happen everywhere, but those 2 things are a massive level up. Just think about the number of phishing attempts, spear phishing attempts to get your Google credentials or your Microsoft credentials. Those are the ballgame. And if you can avoid that alone, that's going to be, in terms of talking about blast radius, you've just minimized it dramatically if you can do that last thing. The first thing, obviously, MFA, do it wherever you can do it. That's a huge win, but it is challenging.
Yeah, it's sort of like where do you get the most bang for the buck here? And that's, it feels like we really need a risk-based approach here. Risk is a combination, where am I the most vulnerable? So inbound spear phishing with email being the front door. And then where are my most critical assets, right? Where will I sustain the most potential damage should that asset get compromised? So
Yeah,
hey, in that context,
go ahead, Doug. Sorry.
oh no, I was just going to transition to this next slide, which is really sort of, okay, so how is MFA currently being employed? Again, sort of mixed mind on this slide, Raj. The first couple of entries here make all the sense in the world to me. We've talked a good bit about increased remote work. I actually have a family member who had to, start working from home really overnight, and his company was not, let's say, remote ready, very technology savvy. And so it took them a couple of weeks to get him set up with access to their VPN and a hard token as for MFA. So the first entry makes sense to me, which is, I want multi-factor for cloud VPN. Multi-factor for cloud management consoles. Again, if I can get access to, the O365 or the AWS console, you really are off to the races. You can really move laterally. You can create additional service accounts with escalated privileges and move laterally across the environment to, I don't know, an RDS database and do data exfil, et cetera, all kinds of scenarios there. And then you can see, respondents are prioritizing based on criticality. Say, hey, we're using MFA for access to our most sensitive cloud resident data. We're using MFA for access to our most critical business applications. And that's all good, but these percentages should be a lot higher. And so given that, we did a data cut around, okay, hey, for those respondents who shared that they had lost data, were they using MFA? And we found a correlation between lack of MFA and data loss. So Raj, I really like where you were going, which is sort of like, hey, get some wins. Like, we don't need to solve for all of the things because that's, it's almost overwhelming. But be focused, like, implement MFA where you do have, where you have risk. Like, let's start there.
AWS, right? Or your Azure console or GCP console, add it to workspaces and Microsoft 365. Just start there.
Yeah.
Like those couple of things alone will have just a massive impact on the level of risk. So I think one of the interesting things here for us is our vision around kind of how to change the dynamics here. I mean, we agree with you that the percentages are far too low. And ultimately, I believe this has a lot to do with friction and the end user experience. I mean, ultimately, our viewpoint is you want to have somebody log into their machine and do it securely. So, whether they put in a password, whether they have another token, whether they use fingerprint, face, like, put that aside. There's some way that they've logged in a very safe, secure manner where we can virtually guarantee they are who they say they are. Once that's happened, is there a way to make it so that they can now log in to everything with that same level of security, but without having to add credentials again, or having to do second factors or third factors or things like that? And that is the challenge that we're working on. And our vision is to solve that through one login, and then you can kind of move in to whatever it is you need. And so that's very difficult to do, of course, because there's so many different types of protocols, there's so many different types of requirements. But ultimately, I feel like when you log in to that machine and you've done so securely, is there a way for you to then access everything else you need without having to have friction for the end user, yet still maintaining that very, very high level of security that we all want? So how can we transfer certificates? How can we transfer MFA tokens? How can we transfer whatever we need to do in a secure manner so that it's really easy on the end user? Maybe that first login is a little bit of a step up, but everything afterwards, subsequently, is much, much easier. So that's our vision of how we're going to solve this problem.
Yeah, and then when you do need to issue an additional challenge, maybe it's context-based, it's adaptive.
Absolutely.
Based
Conditional,
on context
right?
only, where
Absolutely.
Based on analytics, we know there really is something potentially concerning here. And so, yeah, we're going to issue another challenge.
That's right. Maybe your device has something funny on it that we're a little bit concerned about. Maybe you're in a location that we don't quite trust. Maybe the network you're on is not one that we're aware of, or we could be concerned about it. So there's a bunch of different, contexts that we would add, and to that you would level up and say, no, we're not sure you are really who you say you are, especially when you're getting into the AWS console and you're trying to do something significant. We're going to triple check, quadruple check, and do that. I think that's, to me, that's where we're headed, and I think it's a great vision from our perspective of what hopefully our industry can accomplish.
I agree. I think that's spot on.
Absolutely.
We mentioned just being mindful of time. We've mentioned device a couple of times. Zach, let's go to the next slide around device posture. I thought this was a super interesting one, because at the end of the day, we're really talking about how do we establish trust and then maintain that level of trust across all the applications that an end user is accessing. And really that sort of profile or posture of one's device is increasingly becoming a core part of one's identity. Obviously, this has been, even more of a front and center issue because of remote work. The example I shared with you about a family member was actually my son, who had, worked from home overnight. In addition to sending him, token for access to the cloud VPN, they really needed to vet his laptop. It wasn't a company issued laptop. It was a personal machine. So it wasn't sufficient for him just to say, my dad is a cybersecurity industry analyst. They really had to go through, what's the posture of your device? Like, we got to make sure that the device is trustworthy, because that's part of your identity. And Raj, I think that's what we're seeing in these results.
I think the whole concept of zero trust is going to start with, let's make sure the user is who they really say they are, and whatever we need to do, if we need to step up, level up, biometrics, whatever that may be, let's make sure that the device that they're operating on is safe, it's secure, it's trustworthy, all those things. Let's make sure the network that the access transaction it traverses is also safe and it's secured. And then let's make sure that the right authorization is there on the target IT resource that the person's trying to access. That's the whole sort of transaction to me, the access transaction, and it's the zero trust part of that is going to be each one of those individual steps will have significant layers of security around it to make sure that the whole transaction is secure. To me, that's sort of, when you deconstruct zero trust, that's what it is to me.
Access transaction, love it.
Yes, yeah, that's what I think it is. So
totally.
I know we're short on time, but hopefully that helps people think about what zero trust is, at the atomic level.
Yeah, no, it's one of these terms that's getting used quite liberally. So I think the more specific we can be and prescriptive on implementing zero trust, the better.
Yep.
Hey, so in the spirit of solving for some of the problems that we've talked about, we've covered sort of people and some process issues, and then just I think we're going to leave you with a research finding around technology, and really a shift to a cloud-based directory is clearly underway. This is a sort of classic maturity model. So sort of to Raj's point at the outset, in terms of the value of thinking about this research as a benchmark for how your peer group are thinking about the problem space, more importantly, how they're solving for that. This is a great example where there's a appreciable amount of organizations that have already moved to a cloud-based directory as that centralized control plane with distributed enforcement points. And an appreciable percent of organizations are on their way. They're planning to do that over the next little while, next 12 to 24 months, or they're evaluating it. Raj, this is your market. You're working with organizations on their journey to a cloud-based directory every day. This data hang together in terms of what you're seeing in your customer base?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's no doubt that there's cloud transformation going on all across IT organizations. And one of the last things that people have focused on was the directory. It was something that people didn't really think would make the leap over, at least not, until a few years ago. And that's really when we started our business, was to focus on making that transformation from, an on-prem domain controller to going to the cloud and being able to enable these remote environments, these heterogeneous environments and tools, all the great IT technology that's coming out that people want to use. We wanted to enable that. And so that's what a cloud directory is to us. It's connecting a person to whatever it is they need, regardless of location, platform, device type, provider, any of those things. And so, we absolutely agree with this finding that it's moving, it's happening quickly, and it's going to continue to happen.
Right on. Well, That is all we have. Thank you everyone so much for sticking around. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask of Doug and Raj, please shoot those on into the chat. We'd be happy to answer some of those as time permits.
Yeah, happy to stick around for a few minutes if you are, Doug.
Yeah, me too,
If
for
there's
sure.
any
Really fun
questions.
conversation.
Yeah. I don't think we're having any other questions.
I think we must answer them all proactively along the way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, from my perspective, I'd say if there's any questions and folks would like to reach out, just do so through some of the resources that our team put in the chat, and you can always reach us that way, and I'm happy to jump in and answer questions.
Me as well. You bet.
Thanks, Doug.
Right on.
Thanks for taking time. It was a great conversation.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Raj. Really enjoyed it. Zach, thank you.
Absolutely.
All the best,
Happy
everybody.
Zach. Okay.
It's a journey.